One of the first things I always like to talk about is a little bit about the history of American Sign Language. So the sign for history, okay, so the sign for history is H's, so the history of American Sign Language. And what I basically want you to know, and again, you're going to have the handout at the end of the class, but what I basically want you to know is that American Sign Language really came over to America around the 1800s. And so sign language had been used here before it was officially recognized as a foreign language, and like that before it officially was given the title of American Sign Language, people were communicating already in sign language. But after we had some really important people come over from France and help us to develop where we are today as far as what American Sign Language has become today. And so in your Google Drive, you're going to have this particular handout on the history. The reason the history is so important for me to mention is because if we're talking about the history of all languages, American Sign Language is a relatively new language. So because of that, there are still signs that just don't exist for English words. There are also signs that are very regional. So for example, I live here in the Atlanta area. For those of you watching that might live out west, say in California, or maybe you're in New York or in Texas, some of our signs might slightly be different. And I like for you to think of that as like having a synonym. Okay, so for example, the sign for awesome is your double hands, 5 hands up in the air and you bounce down. This sign can also mean for the English word fantastic, terrific, splendid, wonderful. So all these things can mean the same, sign is the same, but the English word counterpart can mean a whole bunch of different things. So when you see a sign in American Sign Language, I always like to use the example of hot dog. Okay, because it's different depending on where you live. The sign for hot dog in some parts of our country is hot dog, whereas in other parts of our country, like where I live down here in the South, sometimes you will also see the sign hot dog. And it doesn't mean that one of the signs is incorrect or so you're signing that wrong. It just means it's a regional variation depending on where you live in the country or the community in which you're signing with. So I like to kind of point that out. And then of course, as political views change and all this other stuff happens, sometimes signs for particular words will change over time. So another example I like to use is a long time ago, the sign for China was we literally pointed right to the eye. Some people tugged down on the eye. We no longer use that sign anymore. And you can probably draw your own conclusions to why. Some people can think that that can be derogatory. So the new sign for China is like the buttons that go on the jacket. So that's a newer sign. So sometimes signs change over time, and that really has to do with a little bit that this language is relatively new. So I want you guys to keep that in mind as well as you're learning.